They laughed at her flip-flops. The sound landed like a blade. It cut through the sticky afternoon air where the sun had turned the asphalt to a dull, shimmering sheet, and the ultraviolet brake lights of a rusted sedan blinked red. Clara felt it in her ribs more than in her ears, the way laughter can make your muscles gather as if to flee. She looked down at the cheap rubber thong stretched between her toes, the faded denim of her jeans, the thrifted sweatshirt that had once been someone else's discard. For a moment she let the smallness of it sit against her like a bruise. She had chosen the clothes on purpose. They made her invisible. That was the point. Inside the car, João's hands shook on the steering wheel. His breath came in short, hot bursts. The back seat reeked of petrol and wet fabric. Beside him, his 7-year-old grandson had fallen asleep against his shoulder, cheek smeared with sand from the morning park. Clara's sister Sophia sat rigid in the front passenger seat, fingernails tapping the upholstery. The traffic stop had been routine, at least it started that way. A red tail light, a shouted brake, a shadow of a uniform approaching. The shadow had multiplied. "Documents," the sergeant said, voice flat as a slate of slate. He held a slim flashlight. Sargento Ricardo Alves was broad in the shoulders and used that breadth the way other men used money, to fill the room. His badge glinted. His smile smelled like oil and small decisions that favored him. João's wallet came out on a trembling palm. He handed the papers like an apology. Ricardo squinted at the registration, then at João's face, then at the child asleep in the car. The sergeant's gaze slid to a bundle of bills in João's breast pocket, as if he could see money like some people can see sunlight through glass. "Don't worry about it," Ricardo said. "We can make this little problem disappear. 50 each. We'll file a warning, no fine. You give us a little for our work." He flicked a look at the other officers leaned against the squad car, lean silhouettes in the heat haze. João's voice was thin. "I don't have that, sir. My card's gone. Then we resolve it here." The sergeant's palm landed on the hood, and the slap that followed was brutal and quick. It sounded worse than it would have on an empty soundstage. It sounded like something breaking. João's cheek flared red. He flinched. His grandson awoke, eyes huge and questioning. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth. Clara didn't think. A kind of animal surge moved under her ribs. She reached across the console and touched João's forearm, a light, steady thing. "That's enough," she said. The sergeant's head turned toward her like a dog hearing a click of a leash. A slow, lazy smile pulled at his mouth. He stepped forward, looming, the flashlight cutting a hard white across Clara's face. He took in her clothes with that condescending assessment of someone who had translated what a woman wears into a line item on a ledger. Disposable, cheap, worth cheap treatment. "Lady," he said, "this isn't your business. Mind your place." For a stupid, incandescent second, Clara considered giving him her name, a name that would move him like a gust, a name that would redirect the stream of his contempt into something like respect. She imagined the uniform going taut, the flash of recognition. Oh, a judge! She imagined him shrinking into a polite apology. But she didn't want to exchange this for humiliation, not like this. There was a bigger calculus at work. She smelled the rot in the precinct. She had heard the rumors on the benches of courthouse corridors. Her job, if it was worth anything at all, required patience that felt like cruelty when you were watching a man be hit and laughed at. Patience would let dignity carry further than immediate self-defense. She kept her voice small. "He doesn't have the money," she said. "He's a driver. He works long shifts. He was on his way to drop off his grandson." Ricardo's laugh rolled out, a coarse, public thing. Then he should have thought of that before he forgot his cards.
He moved like a man who has practiced the gestures of humiliation. He raised his hand as if to give João a second slap. Clara did something else. She pulled a phone from her pocket and tapped one thumb across the screen, an innocuous motion, indistinguishable from any other in a world full of gestures. A camera icon pulsed in the periphery of her mind. She slid the phone just enough to get the angle, the profile of Ricardo's hard jaw, the way his smile split his face, the curve of the badge that glittered with his name. The slap landed. The car smelled of sweat and gasoline and metal. Clara's first reflex was to lunge, to make the world right with her fists. Her second was to breathe. She let the insult fold into her chest like a book closed with care. She remembered then the people waiting in line at the courthouse, men and women who had been minimized into helplessness by the same small cruelties. She owed them beyond her pride. The officers laughed. One of them made a crude joke about the flip-flops. Cheap shoes. Cheap woman, too. The laugh was the pivot. It turned humiliation inside out. It left a clean white vein of anger running through Clara. She watched João collect himself, tongue between teeth, his face going cold and concentrated, as if he were sealing a wound. The child began to bawl softly again, tiny hiccups. Clara slid the phone back into her pocket. She let her hand rest on her thigh as if to anchor herself. She had been a judge long enough to know that sometimes the only way to win was to make sure the loss didn't become a precedent. When the officers finally drove off, squad lights vanishing into the haze, João sat motionless for a long time, breathing like someone settling from an embargo.
Clara reached over and took his hand. It was warm and calloused. "Later," she said quietly, "we'll sort this." He looked at her then with a mix of gratitude and bewilderment, as if he couldn't quite place the armor that had saved him. She said nothing about who she was. At the curb, a stray dog padded by and sniffed the air. The city continued in its small and different way, people moving through heat and commerce while the world recalibrated itself somewhere else. Clara drove them home in a silence that had the weight of a conversation refused. When Sophia asked, gently, like the way you ask about a small scar, "Why didn't you say who you were?" Clara didn't answer with the obvious rationale. She answered with the rules that had always guided her. Invisibility is power. Exposure is a tool to be used on the right targets at the right time. That afternoon, in the thin cool of a public library where they had sat for a coffee, Clara recorded a short note on her phone. The time, the place, the license plate of the squad car, the names she had caught. It was a careful, clinical thing, the bones of an incident compiled like evidence. She also uploaded the photo she had taken, grainy, that perfect blur that makes contempt visible, Ricardo's sneer, the raised hand, the flash of a badge. She typed João's name and the child's age. She made a quick judgment call. Preserve, not confront. A judge with a camera in her pocket moves differently than a judge with a courtroom behind her. The latter commands quickly, the courtroom's gravity and imposition of force. The former is a watcher, a tallier of the small injustices that build into mountains. Clara loved that watching. It was what let her take unpopular positions in legal opinions and still sleep. That night, she didn't go home. She stayed at a modest hotel, the kind that smelled of detergent and old carpets, and she pulled a simple shirt over like a second skin. The changed clothes didn't change anything, but they served the same purpose. She would not walk into a precinct with a robe and a list of demands. She would go in as a citizen who had been wronged. She would make the precinct do what the law requires of it in front of witnesses. She would make them look small on their own stage. She had a contact. Dr. Almeida had been a corregidor for as long as Clara had been reading his reports. He kept his distance professionally, impressed with prudence, but she had a way of making useful people feel that their careers would be better if they aligned, sometimes quietly, with the facts. She sent him a short, coded message earlier that morning, part of a pattern of calls he knew well, with a photograph and a timestamp. The message read, "Incident at AV do Comercio. Possible extortion ring. Witness, João. Minor present. Need rapid oversight." He answered with 4 words and a dispatch code. Acknowledged. Team mobilizing nearby. That code meant a lot.
It meant they were already watching some corners of the precinct for other reasons. Complaints stacking up, rumors of impropriety like lint on a sleeve, and that Almeida's unit could be on location fast if given a reason. It also meant he trusted her enough to act on her word. Clara drove into the precinct the following morning in the same sweatshirt. It was a study in contrasts. The institutional smell, a mix of coffee gone off and the metallic tang of bureaucracy, was underlaid with the faint mildew of damp paper. The front desk cop glanced at her, polite and bored. She signed a visitor's log like a citizen with a grievance. She filled out a complaint form with a steadiness that betrayed none of the night's rumination. Barros, the precinct chief, was a man who wore his authority the way some men wear old cologne. He had a large face that made smiles look like concessions and a voice like carved timber. He greeted her with a slow, ingratiating charm. "Do you plan to make this into a public thing, ma'am?" he asked as he read her handwritten complaint. He held the paper between 2 fingers as if it were a bill he had not yet decided to pay. Clara watched him. He did not offer to fetch a coffee. He did not apologize for the sergeant. He assumed the cost of the city's order was borne by people like João. She could have told him then who she was. She could have produced a badge that made the room different. But the plan required silence until the reveal was a weapon sharp enough to cut through the insulation around the precinct's corruption. Clara had seen larger schemes crumble when their proponents hurried to expose them, so she played the part she'd chosen, a citizen marinated in indignation and helplessness. Barros folded the paper, a practiced, indulgent motion. "You know these things happen. Reports get lost. If you want quick action, we could—" He left the sentence sliding, like a book passed under a table. The bribe was in the implication, a polite detour that asked for a small commitment. Clara watched his mouth. She said, "You're suggesting a fee?" Voice neutral. Barros shrugged. "A courtesy, a way to help things move. We can make the paperwork disappear into a faster channel. 50 each. His tone was casual, reasonable, as if he were doing her a favor. There were cameras in the small lobby, one high in the corner, a square of black glass that reflected everything in a way modern cameras do, without interest, without empathy. She slid her phone across the desk as if to check a message, then nudged it forward so one corner caught the camera's reflective lens. She met Barros's gaze with the kind of small smile she had learned to employ in court when an opposing counsel made a mistake and she wanted him to complete the sentence. "It would make me feel safer if this moved through the proper channels," she said. "I don't have the money they're asking." Barros's eyebrows picked up, a tilt of surprise and amusement. His eyes flicked, without him seeing it, to the reflection in the camera, to a small indicator of a live recording on the phone, and then to Clara's face. For half a breath he considered being brusque. He was a man who preferred things to stay his shape. "Are you accusing my men?" he said. "You don't know what happened behind closed doors." Clara pushed the complaint across to him, sliding the paper until his fingers closed on the corners. "I want an internal investigation," she said simply, "and I want the corregidoria notified." Barros's face shifted. Something thin and quick passed through his expression. Suspicion, annoyance, a taste of panic like metal catching cold. He set the complaint down carefully, as if it were a bomb he was not prepared to hold. "Who are you, really?" he asked. The question wasn't an innocent one. It was a searchlight. She let him lean into curiosity. "A citizen who wants justice," she said. It wasn't a theatrical reveal. It didn't need to be. She called Almeida from inside the lobby, in a voice she kept level and casual. "Dr. Almeida," she said, "this is Clara. Complaint filed at the 15th. Could you—" There was a pause long enough for Barros to notice the way the lobby shifted in temperature. Across the desk, Barros scoffed. "If this is some kind of press thing—" "Not press," Clara said. She let the word shape the silence. "Just oversight." The phone call was short. Her referral contained the time, the badge number she had caught in the reflection, and João's name. She didn't say she was a judge. She didn't have to. Dr. Almeida's reply, calm, efficient, told her they could be there within 10 minutes. 10 minutes was a small window of plausibility, carved by the kind of network she had cultivated, dependencies and loyalties in the architecture of oversight. Almeida could mobilize a team fast because he had reasons to be eager, and because he had a unit that liked showing up quickly when the stakes involved framing a failing precinct in their ledger sheet. He liked scandals that rose to headlines. They were the fertilizer he used to cleanse his garden. He was not above hurry. Barros went pale, his swagger constricted. He asked to see identification. Clara gave him a manufactured name. He peered, unimpressed. He asked her about witnesses, about proof. She put the photograph on the desk, the one she'd taken the day before, and let it sit there like a quiet threat. Images can be interpreted, but they are also stubborn. They waited. Barros called his lieutenant, barked orders in a voice that tried to be ordinary and failed. He told the boys to stay put. The waiting period felt like a scene held between heartbeats. Clara watched the hallway, the way the fluorescent light hummed like a trapped insect, the way a fan stirred stale papers. The lobby clock ticked with a loud, lazy tick that announced seconds with the stubborn dignity of an old judge.
When the Corregidoria's car pulled up, there was no need for theatrics. Almeida arrived with his detail, 3 men in plain clothes, 2 with the slight, officious hardness of men who had learned to read between lines. One of them carried a slim black bag that hummed when it moved, what Clara assumed were recording devices and evidence kits. Almeida himself was unassuming in a rumpled suit, the very picture of competent fatigue. His eyes found Clara's. There was a small nod, an acknowledgement that passed between them like a wire. Barros tried to get ahead of the moment. He called for reinforcements from his precinct, but his voice had the brittle edge of a man whose plans had been undermined. Sargento Ricardo, who had swaggered like a minor king the day before, now kept his shoulders tight. He continued to smile, but it was a smaller thing, a smile that didn't know how to carry contempt anymore. Almeida's team moved with that efficient weirdness of auditors and inspectors. They spoke in clipped phrases that left no room for improvisation. "We have a superiority order," Almeida said, not snappily, simply as if he were announcing the weather. "All officers remain at their posts. We are initiating an immediate review." Barros's protests were like the muttering of a bird no one wanted to hear. Almeida produced a folder of paperwork and the name of a protocol clause that allowed the Corregidoria to secure a precinct when there was substantial evidence of misconduct. The argument was clinical, administrative. It did not need to be violent to be devastating, because the hand that signed the paper was the one that measured a man's liberty in the balance, the symbol of a system that sometimes called itself forth to chastise its own when the stains became too visible. "Sargento Ricardo Alves," Almeida said, and he sounded nothing like a man who took pleasure in the declaration. "You will come with us." Ricardo's mouth opened. He tried, perhaps in his head, to shape a comeback. He had thrived on the assumption that no one would bother higher. He had not built contingencies for the moment the ceiling collapsed. For all his width, he looked suddenly thin. His hands, rough palms, thumbs nicked, trembled at his sides. Clara watched him move toward the door, toward the vehicle where an agent would read him rights in that dull, official cadence that seemed to subtract menace from words. The handcuffs clicked. It was an ordinary sound. It was the sound the title promised, and the public needed to see, more than for her own sake. In a world where small cruelties had grown bold, the handcuffs were an emblem. They were not justice themselves. An arrest is an act in a long procession toward accountability, not its end.
But in the small bureaucratic cadence of a precinct, a handcuff is also the moment a person is made subject to the state's means of correction. Ricardo turned as the officers led him past, and for half a second his eyes found Clara's. The look was not of defeat. It was a recalculation. It was the stare of a man measuring how to fight back. "They think they're done," he mouthed, the words a threat, barely softened into the premises of a threat. He was wrong and right both. They were not done. Inside the Corregedoria vehicle, the radio chatter smelled like business. Almeida's team filed reports. Barrows swallowed a cigarette that he did not light. Clara stood quietly by the lobby window and watched the sergeant's van roll away. The sun was high and relentless. She wished for João and his grandson. She wanted to see them stand in a courthouse and be given simple human dignity like receipt of a document. She felt underneath it all the fibrous weight of the work to come. As the initial sting of triumph settled, an unease crept like a current under the surface. Arresting a sergeant did not decapitate a network. It bruised the outer limb of something larger. Clara knew the laws of escalation. She knew the unpleasant arithmetic of power. Pressure applied in one place would push out in another. Sometimes at home, sometimes at the level of institutions that had more to lose than a sergeant's badge. She noticed her phone buzzing in her pocket. A message flashed from a private line she did not recognize. No caller ID, just short, clipped text. It read, "Good work, but beware small victories." There was no signature. A few minutes later, as the crowd thinned and the precinct resumed the semblance of normalcy someone somewhere had insisted on maintaining, Clara received a call. The number shown was private. The voice on the other end was clean, authoritative, steady as bone. "Judge Mendez?" the voice said. It was not an accusation. It was a baring of teeth that admired its capacity to intimidate. Clara's jaw tightened. "Who is this?" she asked. A soft laugh came down the line. "Armando Siqueira, State Secretary of Security. I heard about the little scandal. Charming, but I would advise caution, Judge." The line went cold in her ear. She let the words settle. Secretary. That was a man with offices that could thrum with power, a man whose reach played across budgets, who fed reports and made them disappear, and who could reorder lives with the press of a pen. He spoke the language of threats, folded into polite concerns. "Your sister," he went on suddenly, as if moving from pleasantries to specifics were no stretch at all, "has been seen. She frequents places we keep track of. It would be a shame if any attention found her." The words landed exactly where he had meant them to hurt. Clara felt a small, cold animal of panic in her belly, an animal she had kept caged for years now. Her sister. Sophia's face flashed in her mind, the woman with quick hands and a softer laugh, who had once left everything to come and live in a cramped apartment so they could be closer to one another. The idea that harm might be visited on her because of the job Clara had chosen felt like a perversion of cause and effect. Clara didn't answer immediately. She measured the risk, as she always did. Judge or not, a private citizen with the wrong enemies can find misery visiting their loved ones in odd ways. A door left unlocked, a car with a taillight smashed, a phone tapping into one's privacy.
The secretary's voice had a civility that hypnotized like a velvet glove covering a fist. "You're overreaching," Clara said, and her voice had the controlled steel of someone placing a piece on a chessboard. "My sister isn't involved in anything." "Of course not," Clara said. "You should understand the advantage of not making enemies unnecessarily." The call ended with a soft click that sounded like a warning. Clara looked at the phone and then at the precinct window. The city outside went on ignorant, oblivious. A bus hissed, a child screamed at a toy, a man cursed at the price of coffee. She had the taste of victory in her mouth and the scent of a threat at her throat. Two things could be true at once. A man had been led away in cuffs, and a more dangerous player had just named her, and by extension her family, as targets. The world had folded in a way that promised further friction. She made two decisions in the span of a breath. One, she would not allow immediate fear to corporatize into retreat. Two, she would plan like someone who understands the strategies of power. She would make the fight bureaucratic and unglamorous and therefore harder to silence. She would call Almeida and tell him everything. She would set in motion procedures, witness protection, reporting, and audit of the precinct's records. She would use the system because she had not the appetite to go outside it, and she would take precautions for Sophia. Before she could move, her phone vibrated again. This time the message was from Cabo Lucas, a young cop she barely knew by face and less by name, who had slipped a note to her the previous day with a single line. "I can help. There's a place they use to stash records and money. I can show you, but not here, not now." His message had arrived days before. It was a small, trembling thing that had made her pulse quicken with the possibility of an inside ally. Lucas was the sort of young officer who looked like he still had hope in his eyes, the kind whom the system chews up slowly with paperwork and ritual. He had been watching, he said, and now he was ready to risk a little. Clara sensed the architecture of the next moves rearrange themselves in her head. The handcuffs were not the end. They were only the first rip in a fabric that hid many things.
If she wanted durable change, if she wanted to protect João and his family, if she wanted to stop the petty extortion that bled the poorest dry, she would need more than a single arrest. She would need evidence, ledgers, recordings, cash trails. She would need witnesses who would not be silenced by fear. She would need the exposure that made radio silence unsustainable. Outside the precinct, someone honked. The street smelled of fried food and the diesel breath of buses. Children shouted. Life moved on in its chaotic indifference as powerful men counted losses they thought manageable. Clara put her phone in her pocket and felt its weight like a compass. She stood at the border between a small victory and a wider war. The 10 minutes promised by the headline had been fulfilled. A man who had laughed at her shoes was in metal and paper and procedural custody. But 10 minutes was nothing in the calendar of dirty networks. It was both triumph and provocation. She walked out of the precinct with Almeida at her shoulder and João waiting by the curb. Their silhouettes were small in the enormous city, but the act of walking felt like something to be accounted for. Clara tried to imagine the ledger that would be opened now, the pages full of names and sums and dates, and knew it would be messy and bitter and full of people who would try to erase their hands from ink that couldn't be scrubbed. Before she left, she asked João to come to the courthouse the next week. She promised a witness coordinator. She promised a thin sheet of protection that would not make him brave, but might make him safer. He looked grateful, like someone rescued from a dryer before the spin cycle ended. The child grinned at her and clutched João's finger, as if that was the only true law. As they walked away, Clara's phone buzzed again. This time the message was an image, grainy, time-stamped, a photo of Sophia leaving a small market outside town. The caption was a single line, "We see your family." The sender was anonymous. Clara's stomach knotted. She folded the phone into her palm and felt the private line press like a pulse against bone. The war was widening. The first gate had opened, not because she had charged through it, but because the system had allowed her a cleft through which she could see the rot. She had taken a step, and in response, the rot remembered its power. She walked with João to his car and watched them drive away. The boy in his arms waved until they turned a corner. Clara and Sophia stood under the streetlight, small and human, embraced. "If they try anything," Sophia said, her voice tremulous, "you'll go after them, right?" Clara looked at her sister's face, at the small scar near the jaw that had come from a childhood scraped along concrete. She swallowed. "I will do everything the law allows, and maybe a little that it forces me to invent." Her voice held the kind of resolve that feels like a promise and a warning at once.
They stayed in the light until the shadows grew long. The city breathed around them. Sirens far off like dogs barking in the distance, the murmur of a life that thinks itself unconnected. Clara felt, clearly and with the painful acuity of someone who has learned to measure risk like currency, the ledger of the next moves. She would need allies inside the machine. She would need proof. She would need to prepare for sabotage. And she had, for a moment, the intoxicating certainty that sometimes the smallest of humiliations, an officer's laugh at a pair of flip-flops, can be the hinge on which larger doors open. The question was, which doors? Those that led to reform, or those that led to reprisal? Clara tightened her grip on the phone and held the image of the sleeping child in João's arms. She felt the weight of the cheap shoes again, small and ridiculous, and thought of the handcuffs inside a Corregedoria van, metal against skin. She felt the taste of that day, the two halves of it. The city hummed, and in that hum something began to move, clear, methodical, and unrelenting. She made a list in her head, quietly, the way clerks tally columns. Call Almeida again, protect Sophia, get Lucas's location, confirm the image's origin, secure João's testimony. She would start compiling evidence that couldn't be burned with a mop bucket. She would not let a flood or a late-night arson erase what she now knew to exist. She turned back to the precinct glass. Inside, life had already resumed its ordinary shape. A radio chirped, someone swore at a printer. The smell of bad coffee rose like a stubborn ghost. The officers who had laughed that afternoon moved through their shifts with small mechanical gestures, as if they had not been seen. It was the same old world, with one new, inconvenient fact. A handcuff had found a place on one of their own. That fact would not go away. Behind her, Sophia slipped an arm through hers. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly. Clara looked at the woman she had loved beyond argument and suffered beyond measure. Fear had a seat in the car with her. It always did. But fear did not rule. "When I am afraid, I plan." She let a small smile steal the edge off. "And when I plan, I like to win." Their steps carried them away from the precinct. The city's heat pressed in, patient and relentless. The chain of events had begun to move. A sergeant led in cuffs, a secretary's voice like a threat, a young cop ready to trade his safety for conscience. Somewhere, records were at risk. Somewhere else, a galpon, an unremarkable warehouse, might hold the paper trail that had lubricated a system of skimming and small cruelties. Clara opened her mouth to speak, and then closed it. Currency was words. She placed them carefully. "If this grabbed you," she said suddenly, not to Sophia, but to the invisible audience that sometimes seemed present when she made public appeals in her mind. "If this matters to you, stay with it." Witnesses make a difference. It felt like a small human gesture to say it aloud. It was the only CTA she could think to make in that moment. Do not look away. They walked until the sun softened and a wind stirred the edges of the city. Clara's phone buzzed once more. A short message. Lucas, 1900, Warehouse District. Then nothing. She folded the phone into her pocket and breathed. The evening had the shape of a plan. The 10-minute victory had occurred, and the consequences were already rippling outward. The real work was only beginning. The warehouse district smelled of oil and cold concrete. Night hung low, a flat, indifferent ceiling pierced by sodium lamps that gave the loading docks a jaundiced halo. Pallets leaned like tired sentries. Forklifts lay silent in shadows. Clara moved without rush, a plain hoodie pulled over her head, the cheap flip-flops hidden now by worn sneakers. The city had a way of falling away at the edges here, its noise swallowed by the hollow of industrial roofs, so that the things people hid under fluorescent bulbs seemed to belong to another world. A silhouette detached itself against a shuttered door. Cabo Lucas stepped forward, younger than Clara had imagined up close. His collar still smelled faintly of sweat and chain smoke. His uniform was a thrifted jacket over a plain tee, as if he had tried to erase the badge the way people erase names from a guest list. He kept his voice low. "You shouldn't have come alone," he said. "I wanted to be alone." The answer was true and tactical at once. Less chance of us being noticed together. He nodded like a boy who'd been lectured before and deserved the scolding. "They're careful with visitors. Only trusted carriers bring the books. Most nights it's moved in parts. Ledgers, cash, small envelopes. Tonight the man in charge is supposed to sort the week's receipts. He's sloppy. He leaves a door unlocked for 15 minutes after midnight." Lucas led her to a low wall and pointed across a narrow service lane. There it was. A corrugated metal building with a block of boarded windows and a single lamp that bled a thin cone of light. The signage had been painted over and then painted over again until it became decorative nonsense. "Why tell me?" Clara asked. "Because I can't do this on my own," he said. "Because if they find out I told, they'll call me a traitor and make my life a lesson. Because I have a sister. Because João's things happen to people I care about." His jaw hardened. "Because I saw what they do, and because I think, maybe foolishly, you'll make them stop in a way I can't." Clara didn't ask for promises. She asked for details. He told her what he knew. The days accountants dropped off envelopes, the way a small subcommittee of officers laundered an occasional cash sum through a community project that never existed. The folded slips of paper with names and amounts that acted like a private ledger. He described the man they called the secretary's cleaner, a civilian courier who handled cash and had a taste for late whiskey. He spoke of a slipshod storage system, unmarked boxes, a back room lined with shelves where fat envelopes and battered notebooks slept like hidden seeds. "How do you know it's all there?" Clara asked. Lucas pulled from his jacket a small marked map, a folded square of grease and ink. At the center, a dot was circled with a ballpoint. Around it, shorthand notes: cash, weekly, books, monthly, camera blind, south entrance, exit, manhole, shift change, 1845. The handwriting trembled in places. "Because I saw a ledger once," I almost whispered. "I copied a page on my phone. I had to act like I was reading a ticket. I couldn't take the phone out. I only got a picture of one line, but it was enough to make things make sense." Clara lifted the corner of the map and saw a faint smear of coffee and a number that matched a name she had overheard in the precinct, a contractor who contracted nothing but cash. The geometry of it lined up. The ledger was not a myth. It had pages. They walked the perimeter together, bodies hunched against the wind that moved through crates like a curiosity. They checked for cameras, old ones covered in grime, one with a cracked lens and a sagging cable. Lucas had planned contingencies, a decoy motion to pull a night porter away, a timed call to a known courier who could be stalled. He had a route to the manhole cover that opened to a service tunnel, a crawl space for one person. He had no illusion of heroics. He had learned to plan for small miracles and to count on them. Clara listened. She asked for a small, concrete assurance that Almeida would be ready to move if the signal went live. Lucas swallowed and said he could trigger the stream to the Corregidoria's secure feed from a device he could carry. It wasn't perfect. Cellular coverage in the warehouse district was spotty, but Lucas had been cunning enough to test the signal at the margins. There was a place near the loading ramp where a handheld transmitter could piggyback on a corporate Wi-Fi with a weak password and bounce to a relay Almeida's team could pick up. "That's sloppy," Clara said. "Sloppy sometimes works, better than nothing." There was an irony in the way they assembled the simplest of plans out of worn pieces, paper maps, a borrowed password, a phone, a handshake. It was all the system allowed when the system itself was compromised. Clara thought about chain of custody and how fragile it could be if steps were rushed. She catalogued in her mind how Almeida would need to feel any material they brought out, who would be present for entries into the warehouse, who would bear witness. "Tell me the exact plan," she said. They moved like two chess players setting the board. Lucas would slip inside the galpong through an unlocked service door and take visual stock.
"You keep your hands visible. You remember who you are." Lucas swallowed. "I remember," he said. The sky turned the color of old pennies as they retreated to designated points. Clara sat in a parked car with the engine off and breathed the evening air. Sophia had insisted on staying nearby, an argument Clara reluctantly accepted. The sister sat with arms folded, a knit cap bunched around her hair, eyes that refused to be calmed by talk. "You don't have to do this," Sophia said for the second time that night. "I don't have to do any of this," Clara replied. "I choose to." At 1912, a single line of text came, "In." At 1918, "Transaction." Clara closed her mouth and listened to the city as if it were a body. In her pocket, the transmitter made a tiny, reassuring whistle. The feed had latched, and Almeida's voice came low and calm through the encrypted channel. Clara could hear the muffled clack of pallets and the cough of a cigarette. She could hear, faintly, a man's voice, the courier, and the rustle of paper. She stepped out into the lane and walked toward the rusted door. The night bent around her. Inside the galpon, the air was warm and sawdust heavy. The men looked up as she entered. They were the kind of faces that age hard around the mouth. There were stacks of boxes, a pallet of cleaning supplies, a folding table with an ashtray, and a chair with a chin of someone who weighed his decisions too long. "Can I help you?" one man asked, without moving his gaze from the envelope he was slipping into a ledger. Just being there was a kind of law. People say things when a stranger stands in the doorway, because strangers have the power to interrupt a script. She had practiced a face that looked like too many women he had dismissed for convenience, tired, indifferent, brittle with a life of errands. She let it settle. "I'm just looking for a place to warm up. This rain's waiting for me 5 blocks away." They chuckled, and one of them, broad shoulders, curling mustache, pushed himself up as if to make a space. The man with the ledger, his hands, was the courier, the duct-taped competence of someone who had been working too long without night off. He smiled like a man who liked to keep secrets in his pockets. Conversation unspooled in small motions, barbs about the city, jokes about the mayor, a gripe about the press. The man with the ledger slid it closed, a small book with a thumbprint of coffee on the cover. He did not lock it, he did not guard it as if the ink could bite. He trusted routine. Clara stood where the light caught her face and let the men talk. She asked a casual question about the courier's watch. He answered. She joked about the soot on the rafters. He answered. She watched the ledger like a hawk waiting for a twitch. When the courier flipped the pages, she saw the names and numbers marching across columns in a neat, guilty hand, amounts, dates, initials.
There were entries that matched the one she had seen on Lucas's photo. There were abbreviations that hinted at other precincts. She let her hand brush a cheap cup and pretended to steady it. Her thumb found the edge of the tiny transmitter Lucas had planted minutes earlier. She pressed the soft button once to ensure the feed remained live. Then she let it sit like a breathing thing. "You're from around here?" the courier asked suddenly, his gaze uncurled like a snake. "I'm from everywhere," Clara said. It was a line that fit her as well as any legal maxim. The courier laughed, and in the small looseness of liquor and confidence, he spoke of a man he called the secretary's man, who liked his whiskey neat and his books tidy. He said he was careful, but the way he said it exposed the seams. He was proud of his neatness, as if it proved the scheme's permanence. He said the ledgers were moved twice a month, and that there was a safe place beneath a false floor. He gestured at a pallet, as if the secret were obvious. Clara let him talk. Her presence was the mirror she used to make villains reveal the shape of their shame. At one point, the courier reached to rake his fingers through his hair, and the ledger slid, its spine showing a label on the inside that matched a coded mark she'd seen once in a complaint file. The detail mattered. Then, something shifted in the doorway, a sound of a lost shadow. A head turned. Clara's chest tightened. She noticed it with the cold clarity of someone who had rehearsed failure as a possible outcome. A man had come in, heavier than the rest, face like washed stone. He was not the courier. He wore a jacket that carried the smell of other rooms, a different kind of authority. He moved like someone who had spent years giving orders. "You're late," the heavier man said, and his voice smoothed the words like oil spreads on water. The courier swallowed like a man who had been given a small cold breath of warning. There was a rustle. The ledger slid closed. A thin smile, an old habit, crossed the heavy man's mouth as he looked at Clara. He took in the hoodie, the plain shoes, sighed slightly, like a man pleased to be in a room where his dominance could be measured against something small. "You told me to watch the door," the heavy man said to the courier. "You let a woman wander in. You let gossip in." The thick man moved closer, and Clara felt how the air tightened. He smelled faintly of aftershave and fearlessness. He asked what she wanted. Her answer was the careful set of a woman who had learned to open boxes gently. An apology, a story. "I couldn't stay out in the rain. I didn't realize it was so exclusive." The thick man smiled, a small, practiced thing. He reached out, a soft touch to the ledger, as if he could claim it by feeling. He flipped it open, and in a motion meant to intimidate, he thumbed a page and murmured names. Ink scraped. At that moment, distant and yet as close as breath, the transmitter pinged. Almeida's voice came through on the secure feed, crisp as a gavel. "We are receiving. Please hold." The thick man's eyes narrowed. He didn't move faster. He moved like a man not panicked, but annoyed. He made a decision to test them. He snatched for Clara's phone, reached across the table with an easy assumption of dominance. Clara let him get as far as his fingers without fight. The room smelled suddenly of tobacco and sweat and the metallic tang of possible violence. He touched the phone, and in that small physical reach, the whole plan teetered. Clara saw his hand close. She saw the moment his thumb brushed the screen. She thought of the small quiet of a courtroom, of a ledger being opened to reveal a man's private calculus. For a heartbeat, she imagined handing him back the phone and letting him walk out with the night. She chose the other way. She stepped in, close enough so that his fingers curled around the phone and her body was pressed against his. Nobody moved fast. They moved with practiced slowness because rapid motions would reveal panic, and panic is an invitation. She was within arm's reach of the ledger. Her hand hit his wrist like an accusation, hard and quick. The room smelled of old coffee and leather. "What do you think you're doing?" he said, not with anger, but with the bored tone of a man who believed he still controlled the story. Clara looked at him, and in her face there was the slow, terrible clarity she carried when she read a case, the knowledge that an action had consequences, and that those consequences were owed to someone other than him. "This ledger belongs to the people in those names. You are hiding what you steal from them." It was not a plea, it was a fact she presented like evidence. He laughed. "And what are you going to do?" he asked. "Call the Corregidoria? We already cleaned the precinct. What else do you have, lady in a hoodie? Flattery? A clever face?" She let the room feel the small weight of her silence. People hate a quiet that suggests preparation. The ledger lay open between them like a tender. "Hold on," she said softly, and reached down to the table as if to stabilize herself. Her fingers closed on the small transmitter Lucas had placed, and she let it make a soft beep like a sleeping thing finding breath. The man's hand flicked to a drawer, and he pulled a small pistol from under a rag. It was ugly and ordinary, and exactly the thing he believed made him whole. Clara saw its metal and thought of a child's sleeping cheek at João's house. Her breath narrowed. "Now we do something else," he said, the laugh gone from his throat. "Now we clean out these visitors." At the edge of the room, a radio cracked, and a new voice cut the air, not Almeida's, a voice that slid into things like a knife. "You will set down the weapon. Everyone will remain where they are. This is a warning." It was the wrong voice to hear. The thick man's hand tightened on the gun.
Then something remarkable happened. His shoulders moved as if someone had switched off a weight. He glanced at the doorway, and for a second his face registered a different sort of fear, the kind of fear that arrives when a person realizes other men with worse patience and sharper tools might be watching. Clara made a decision in that second. She had two options: try to disarm him and risk bullets, or let the bluff work. She chose the bluff. She placed both hands on the ledger and said, loud enough for her phone to pick up, "You know they can see you. They can hear everything. They are 10 minutes out. The Federal Oversight Unit has satellite voice capture. If anyone moves, you're done." The thick man laughed in a thin, incredulous way. "Satellite?" he scoffed. "Who do you think you are, some kind of angel?" Then the feed put a voice into the room that silenced scoffing. It was Almeida, firm and calm, but with a procedural edge that carries the authority of men who write decrees. "We are physically outside," Almeida said, and the sound was a cold thing. "We have an entry team. We recommend compliance. We will not signal until our warrant is in hand, unless we see movement that indicates burning of evidence or injury to citizens." That was the legal gravity. It had the peculiar power of making illegal threats seem less than they were. It allowed the men in the galpon to appreciate the risk with their own pragmatic minds. The thick man's thumb strayed to the trigger. He was a man who had trusted fear as a tool, and now found himself forced to accept its reverse. He told the courier to close the ledger and to dump the envelopes in a bucket. The courier moved fast, fingers shaking. The thick man did not shoot. He only glared, and in his glare there was a math. How much could he risk, with the Corregidoria 10 minutes away? Clara kept the ledger with both hands, as if the book itself might be evidence enough to anchor the men in caution. She counted breaths. In the back of her mind was the image of João's grandson sleeping in a car. It kept her from making reckless moves. A noise at the shutter, then a shudder of movement, and a figure appeared at the back of the galpon. Lucas, pale and sweating, stood framed in the light. He had come up the way he had described, through a side entry, and his face showed the strain of being someone who had promised more than he felt able to give. For an instant, the room perceived him as a traitor or a hero, depending on where each man's greed rested. The heavy man moved like a strike, and the courier ducked behind a crate. Lucas lifted his hands. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "I told you I'd come for one thing, that ledger. I didn't mean for all of this." The thick man's eyes flicked to Lucas, and in that flicker there was recognition. Lucas was not just any cop. He had been on passes, seen things, known enough to be both helpful and dangerous. The heavy man made a decision. He would make Lucas the example.
He reached for his gun. Clara's heart thudded. A shot would change everything. It didn't come. Before a gun could be fired, a noise like a distant storm rolled through the warehouse. A heavy vehicle, a chorus of footsteps. The metal door at the far end vibrated as if someone had pushed with force. Then voices, official, tight, commanded, "Police, Corregidoria, and National Unit, open up." Panicked movement began. The courier shoved envelopes into the pockets of his jacket. The heavy man grabbed the ledger and shoved it into a metal trunk, his face taut. Men moved toward the exits with the mechanical efficiency of men trained to escape. In that chaos, one of them shoved against a shelf, and a box of old paper fell open, spooling loose the kind of receipts that had once been evidence of crime, and now evidence of desperation. Clara kept her hands steady on the ledger until men began to move like actors aware they were on a stage. She knew Almeida's team could not storm in without a warrant unless something justified immediate entry. The courier's movement to burn or destroy had been that possibility. So Almeida had called in a measured show of force, 2 unmarked vans, agents with plain clothes and legal letters, a tactical team posted at the blind spot. They had the moral and legal authority to act quickly, to seize, and to secure. In the confusion, the heavy man bolted for a back exit. He was faster than he looked, a sinew of anger finding path. Lucas moved as though he would intercept. He was young, but he had the muscle memory of training. He lunged. Hands caught the heavy man's arm and twisted. There was a brief shove, a flash of metal. The heavy man went down hard, not in the slow chaos of a bullet, but in the clumsy human collapse of someone overwhelmed. Lucas found himself on top of him, breath shuddering, as if he had pulled down a small planet. Almeida's team burst in seconds later, faces drawn like knives. They swept through, commanding the men to the floor. The air tasted like dust and adrenaline. Agents moved with the slow assurance of men who had rehearsed restraint. Hands were cuffed. The heavy man who held the pistol, the man who would be later identified as Armando Siqueira's courier, was handcuffed with a certain ironic finality, his fingers empty of the power he had wielded. The ledger went into an evidence bag. The envelopes were counted and photographed on site by a woman from Almeida's team who had the patient hands of a clerk turned auditor. Every receipt was photographed, every page scanned. Mobile evidence kits were used to capture fingerprints. A chain of custody card was filled out and signed. The team filmed the seizure from multiple angles, stacking documentation inside the kind of bureaucratic armor that makes later courtrooms harder to lie out of. They sealed boxes with tags and signatures. Clara watched the methodical procession like someone watching a liturgy.
In the chaos, a man at the edge of the room, whom Clara had not noticed before, older, clean-shaven, a presence like a smoothed stone, moved with quiet command. Almeida approached him, and for a second Clara felt a new weight in the air. The man wore no insignia, but his eyes were sharp as if he had read too many accounts of misdeeds. He introduced himself in a tone that suggested both the letter and the spirit of law. "Prosecutor Costa," he said. He was the federal liaison, a man who had been briefed and had chosen to be present because when local rot spreads to institutional rot, the law sometimes needs a wider foot to stand on. They processed the scene like a factory of evidence: cameras, bags, sealed envelopes, digital images. The ledger's pages were photographed at high resolution and then secured in evidence lockers. Lucas sat on a crate and breathed hard, hands cuffed behind his back, until agents could confirm he was the inside source. He was trembling, but his eyes caught Clara's, and in their small communication there was relief as solid as any metal. "Good work," Almeida said, when he could find the room to say it. He didn't say it like comfort, he said it like someone noting that a hard, precise thing had been completed. "We have probable cause to expand this. There are names here, figures that match other reports. We'll need to move this into formal charges." The heavy man, later identified by the courier's nickname as the Cleaner, was taken out through a side door into a van. His face to the night, he had the look of a man who had been stripped of a myth. Whether he would talk remained to be seen. Men who bat the edges of powerful nets sometimes keep their mouths closed as a policy.
"Where is Armando Sequeira?" Clara asked quietly. The name still felt like a stone caught in the throat of the night, heavy and present. Almeida's face tightened. "We have leads," he said, "but he is not here, not yet. There are connections to the office, transfers that suggest political shielding. We're moving on every front." Clara watched them load the boxes and thought of the way networks hide in the folds of official offices. She felt at once satisfied and hollow. Evidence was a thing that could be counted and argued. It was also fragile. A paper could be burned, a server corrupted, a witness intimidated. That night, they seized enough to justify a sweep. Ledgers linking precinct men to wallet transfers, slips naming contractors who funneled money, photographs of envelopes in municipal accounts. They had more than the ledger Lucas had found. They had receipts that matched entries in other complaints, audio fragments that, when cleaned by forensics, might show voices and the barter of favors. They packed the evidence into vans. They took statements from the men in custody. They offered Lucas witness protection paperwork and the possibility of relocation. He seemed stunned by the options.
He signed forms as if the ink were a rope throwing him towards safety. The press arrived like a weather system the following morning. Camera lights cut the city's warm light into days. Headlines were cautious, then bolder. Local extortion ring exposed. Then, internal network reaches into political offices. The narrative leapt in the wires from a smashed precinct to the corridors of government. Sequeira's office issued a terse statement. Laws must be allowed to proceed. The secretary denied involvement and promised full cooperation. The usual dance of denials began, but the ledger could not be denied by lip service. The cascade began. Arrests unfolded methodically. A lieutenant here, an accountant there, a municipal contractor subpoenaed. Almeida's team coordinated with the federal liaison to pursue financial trails. Forensic auditors traced transfers. Server logs were recovered from mirrored backups in cloud archives. A tax office provided copies of vendor receipts that matched ledger lines. The small, petty extortion had been a visible surface to a deeper flow of money and influence. In the press conference, Almeida, flanked by the federal liaison in a row of file boxes, used measured language. He emphasized due process. He explained the seizure protocol. He said arrests had been made and more were to follow pending further investigation. Clara watched from the back of the room, hood down, hands folded. She let the journalists talk to her for a moment, her face an ordinary thing. Then she withdrew into the logistics of the follow-up. The political fallout was immediate and bruising. Sequeira, who had once operated from a marble office with ornate letters on the door, found himself the subject of a formal inquiry. He denied wrongdoing. His allies spun tales of overreach, of politically motivated persecution. But some of his friends who counted reputations the way merchants count coins began to whisper, "The ledger is hard to dismiss. Ink and paper carry a stubborn gravity." Inside the courthouse the next week, courtroom clerks processed motions and detention orders. Prosecutors with thin smiles prepared the first indictment, charges of extortion, corruption, money laundering. Hearings were scheduled with a rapidity that felt, to Clara, like a relief. The law moved in clumsy, purposeful steps, bills of indictment, warrants, interrogations. It was not instantaneous. It was grinding and sustained. She visited João in a small living room that still smelled faintly of the morning park. He had a small trophy of dignity now, a letter from the municipal complaint unit acknowledging receipt of his statement, a promise of a small protection stipend while the case moved forward. His grandson was better for sleep and the things children forget when no one teaches them to hold grudges. They spoke of simple things, the sonnet of daily life, the small measures of comfort. Clara gave João a phone number for a victim support unit. He held her hand, a calloused, recalcitrant grip, and thanked her. It felt less than she would have wanted. Justice will always be more than restitution, but it was tangible and human and honest. Sophia, who had feared the worst, began to breathe with a new steadiness. The anonymous photos stopped. Almeida arranged for a discreet security detail for her, 2 officers who did not blazon their presence. Clara, who had been a judge and thus trained to leave ego at the door, found herself grateful for the small domesticities of safety: a friend available to pick up groceries, a neighbor who would call if something strange happened. Lucas was placed in protective custody for a while. He gave testimony. It was brave, in the way ordinary people are brave, a sequence of small acts strung together by resolve. He named names, described patterns, described a culture that had normalized small thefts into ritual. He cried once in the witness room, and Clara, who had felt the city like a ledger of suffering, sat with him and did not speak. She let his courage be a thing that did not need words. The bigger fish did not go down without a fight. Cicada hired lawyers who launched preemptive attacks in the press, insinuations about entrapment, about political motives, about a rogue corregidor overstepping his bounds. They called for calm and suggested the corregidoria's rapid move was a violation of process. But the evidence was not just a story, it was a weight that argued in ink. The ledgers had been filmed, photographed, synchronized with bank records. Witnesses had been corroborated. Forensic audio analysts were able to remove noise and pick up conversations that matched the ledger entries. Bribery schemes like this survive in the interstitials between accounting and denial. They lean on the convenience of bureaucrats and the invisibility of the poor. When exposed, they rely on the complexity of law to confuse and delay. Clara understood this. She also understood that public pressure could be a lever to prevent quiet decay. There were marches, small at first, neighborhood groups holding signs demanding accountability. The press did its work, some of it clumsy, some of it luminous, and the public watched. Not everything cleaned up. Some people slipped away, middlemen who changed their names, accountants who claimed memory loss. Some files were missing despite the seizure. Someone had burned a copy in a backyard, or so one witness claimed. A few officers were suspended without pay. Others were quietly reassigned to distant posts. What was true, however, was that the garden had been tilled, a fungus had been exposed, and a surgeon had reached in with steady hands. Clara attended court sessions not as judge but as witness and coordinator. She provided statements about the initial incident, about the phone call, about the careful plan. Her presence, modest, hooded at first, became known as the woman who chose invisibility, not out of shame, but out of strategy.
"You lost the cheap shoes in all this," she said. It was an attempt at levity, but it landed as something tender. Clara smiled, a small permission to be ordinary. "They were only a costume," she said. "I didn't need them anymore." The legal process rolled on as the media cycle spun. The federal liaison continued to push for audits of related offices. Almeida's unit published a report that recommended procedural changes, better oversight for traffic stops, mandatory body cameras with encrypted upload protocols, clearer complaint channels for citizens. Some of the recommendations were adopted, others disappeared into committees and slow lawmaking. The ledger had forced a conversation. The conversation was the beginning of an accountability architecture that, like any public policy, would require watchful citizens. In the months that followed, Clara instituted small habits to keep herself equanimous: a morning walk before the city woke, a thin soup at a vendor who knew how she liked it, a call to João every 2 weeks to ask about court dates and check on the boy. She returned to her bench at the courthouse when needed, and on days she wasn't presiding, she met with victim advocacy groups and quietly mentored younger judges about how to spot the webs that often hid in plain sight. One late night, while the city hummed with a kind of tentative calm, Clara stood looking at a small display in a room where the seized evidence was kept in locked, cataloged boxes. She ran a gloved finger along a row of sealed envelopes and thought about the way paper keeps the memory of theft. She thought about the men who had made a business of humiliation and the people who had been made small. She thought about how the clerk at the courthouse had once told her quietly, "We always need someone to bother with the details." She had been that bother. And she sat with the modest contentment of someone who had done a necessary task well, not for fame, not for applause, but because someone had to turn the pages and read the names. The work remained. There were appeals and motions, legal pushes to suppress evidence, strategists who attempted to muddy the ledger. But allies gathered, a few honest officers who had been shamed into conscience, journalists who kept tracing the money, community leaders who insisted their neighbors not forget, a federal prosecutor who refused to let a file die. It was the beginning of a different kind of wearing down, slow, persistent, procedural. One morning, months later, Clara received a letter. It was not fan mail. It was a short note written in the hand of a woman she had never met, a mother of a man who had been released from the precinct's hands because the ledger had shown payments. The letter read only 3 sentences. "Thank you for the truth. My son has work again. He eats. We can keep him. I do not know how to repay you."
Clara folded the little note and kept it in her wallet, because sometimes the smallest proof of worth fits in the space of a private hand. The city did not change overnight. Impunity does not fall at a single hand. But patterns shifted. Officers who had once laughed at cheap shoes learned to appear in courtrooms to answer questions. Contractors who had once skimmed payments found their names on public lists. Some officials who had smiled with confidence now found themselves shepherded into hearings where they had to explain ledger entries that held them like nets. The last scene that matters is modest. Clara sat at a small kitchen table one evening with Sophia. A kettle hissed. They ate noodles and watched a dull television program about a rainy city. Sophia reached across and squeezed her sister's hand. "You did good," she said. Clara looked up and met her sister's eyes. "We did what we could," she said. "Not perfect, not final, but we did not let them go unseen." Sophia laughed softly. "And the shoes?" she asked. Clara looked down at her feet. She was barefoot at the table. The flip-flops were nowhere to be found. She remembered the way they had seemed to belong to her for a night, and then became a symbol she used and set aside. "They did their work," she said, "like tools do. You use them and put them away." Outside the window, the city's lights pulsed like a private thought. The ledger entries had been exposed, the men had been shown in their habits, and the conversation about accountability had widened in ways that would require more than one person to keep alive. Clara understood that the fight was generational. Slow law, public pressure, institutional care. She picked up her phone and scrolled through messages. Almeida's terse report, Lucas's text with a photo of his first week at a job he could keep because no one had burned him. A picture João had sent of his grandson in a new pair of shoes. Her chest filled, briefly, with something that felt like relief. Before the evening closed, she set the small transmitter Lucas had given her in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a tool labeled with memory. It had done what it was supposed to do. It had made a moment visible. If she had any final thought, it was not about fame. It was about obligation. She had once believed law was a strict ledger that would balance on its own if left alone. Now she knew law needed diligence and people who would make noise and take measured risks, who would clutch paperwork and bear witness. The 10 minutes on a hot curb had been a pivot. What followed had been long, messy, human work. Clara stood at the window and watched the city breathe. She felt the small tug of sleep and the heavier tug of continuing duty. There would be more deadlines, more reports, more young officers who needed someone to reassure them they would not be punished for truth. There would be men who tried to hide ledgers in new warehouses under new lights,